I'm going to talk about packaging trends that are leading to increased 483s. Do you guys know what 483s are? So, those are those nice letters that the FDA leaves you with when they're done inspecting your facility, right? So, we're going to talk about those. But before I get going, I want to say thank you to Pat Lixel. He is my FDA officer that helped me put the data together. And we're going to go through the information that he data mined. Okay, so here's my agenda. I'm going to go through the CFRs, or the Code of Federal Regulations, and then I'm going to talk about some observations, or 483s, and then I'm going to go through some recall data. So those are different than 483s because these are the ones that the manufacturers instigated. Then I'm going to go through some tests to mitigate these risks, okay? All right, so the Code of Federal Regulations are broken down into sections. 820.130 is specific to device packaging. And basically it states that each manufacturer will ensure that the packaging and the shipping is designed and constructed to protect the device from alterations during shipping, handling, all of those processes that your product goes through as it's manufactured to its endpoints. The second one I'm going to talk about is 20.75, and this is validations. So it's specifically sterilization and packaging processes have to be validated. And then those validation activities need to be documented and performed by qualified individuals. 820.70 is production and process controls. So this is, again, how the FDA applies their packaging and their regulations to what you're doing. This one is that you're going to develop and conduct, control, and monitor the production process, ensuring that your device meets the specifications that you have designed. This includes your validation activities. And again, it comes right back down to making sure that the people doing these activities are qualified for that process. And then the last two I want to bring to your attention is 820.3, which is design, and then 820.72, inspection, measuring, and test equipment. You're making sure that the equipment that you're using for your test and for your manufacturer is not only suitable for its intended purpose, it's capable of creating validated results, and that it is traceable to regulations. Okay, so this is where Pat did all of his really hard work. We're going to look at data from 2016 to 2017, just so that you get an idea. I took a look at the data from 2018, 2019, and we're talking filtering through 23,000 pieces of data to come up with this type of information. So it's a lot of work that goes into classifying these into different categories. I want to bring your attention to a couple of different points. Design control, validations, both of them increased over the years. And looking at it from 2018 and 2019, it continued again to increase in these observations and these recalls. So let's get into a couple of the different categories and the different kinds of things that they're noticing that's out there. So the first thing I categorize these in is to different sections. Configuration changes was one of the top 483s. So we're talking about somebody made a change to the packaging and they either didn't validate it or they didn't assess whether it was correct. Another finding was that they changed the sterilization. So they were doing gamma dose, increased it by 10 kilogray, and made no assessment whether that affected either the product or the packaging. So I know a lot of you are looking at me with these scrunched up faces. It seems logical that people would do this, right? But these are literally 483s. The biggest category that I thought was interesting was the changing in shelf life. So the requirement in the standards is that you have to validate your process over your established shelf life. And if you read some of these, number one, the shelf life testing wasn't done. The increased shelf life testing didn't occur, or they re-sterilized and then sold their product on the market without assessing anything. So it's interesting that this type of issue is out there, but I believe that we are moving more towards getting this under control with the new standards and revisions that are coming out. And I'll talk about that a little bit. Process validation was broken up into equipment and then the actual seal. So looking that the equipment wasn't validated, that the machine did not meet its specifications, or that it was actually validated differently from what was used in a manufacturing environment. So, and then with regard to the seal, the actual sealing process was not validated. Or it didn't cover all the different types of configurations. And the interesting one at the bottom down here too is that there was no rationale for sample size. This is a very common one that we're starting to see more and more as a test laboratory. It used to be acceptable that you could just pick a sample size because that's what everybody did. It was a sample size of 11 or 30. But now it's more than that. You have to sit down and do a justification. You need to look at patient risk. You need to look at the quality systems that you have in place. And all of those things, along with statistics, can drive how to determine a sample size. A quick look at production and process controls. Their oven that was used as part of the accelerated aging wasn't qualified to do that. The sealers were producing contaminants in the packaging and no procedure for monitoring the sealing parameters. So they were randomly sealing them and sending them out. Finally, the supplier, the company purchased pouches that were preformed, and the supplier had not validated those packages, and then inadequate instructions for maintenance of the sealing machine. So the next part, I'm going to get into device recalls. And the fun thing about this is you're going to see that they're exactly the same or similar to what the FDA was seeing as part of their observations. So these are specifically the design recalls, and you can notice that there's been a significant shift in the unknown. Well, what that category captures as part of unknown is that the seal integrity could be reduced or compromised. So in essence, that green bar on the right actually becomes part of the orange. And you can see that there's a significant increase in those type of categories from one year to the next. So let's look at what those were. Design, punctures, cracks, rubs, which is creating abrasion. We're looking at the products moving inside the pouches, and possibly that the protective barrier came off during ship testing. So either way, each of these configurations could have been mitigated by ensuring that the design was done correctly from the start. Additionally, we all know that you're not supposed to fold your packaging. It's easy to go to your supplier and buy a pouch off the shelf and put your device inside there, but that's not the right approach. You want to make sure that the device that you're using fits correctly into your packaging and that you're not folding and crunching it and stuffing it into a box. Then the last one there is that they failed their distribution simulation testing and they didn't continue on. So next, look at production and process controls. We had 245 recalls that dropped down to 76, but then in 2018 it jumps up to like 250, and then 2019 is 256. So it went down like there was something in place to make a correction, and then all of a sudden it shot right back up. So Validation was becoming more prevalent, and so I think that's why we saw a decrease here. And then seal integrity becomes a more intense focus. So this one broke down into several issues. We've seen these in the 483's, right? The wrong sealer, the transport pouch was puncturing as they moved through the system, the equipment wasn't calibrated, the sealing temperatures were not adequate. These are all equipment-related issues. When you look at the material, the itemized recalls were that there was variation in the SBS material. The forming of the tray pouch was too thin, and we've recently run into this type of an issue at our facility. As the customer was moving through a distribution cycle, they found out that the corners of their tray were actually cracking. And when we went back and started investigating with the molding manufacturer, it found out that the actual curvature of the trays was thinning out the plastic, causing it to crack. So these are actually very applicable situations that we're seeing in today's market. Additionally, when we're talking about testing, a lot of people are not using worst case. The labeling of the component is not appropriate, and then there's inadequate training. So we're going to take a look at supplier recalls. So these are the people that make the pouches, and then you purchase them. So this one you would hope wouldn't exist because you're relying on them to make a validated package for you. And yet here we are today seeing that these events actually exist. We've got tears, punctures, and seals. So here's a summary of some of the things. It's pretty much exactly what it is. Tears, punctures, or seals were identified in the packaging when they were received. This is a new one that I haven't seen, and it's recalls due to employee errors. The interesting thing is that it all comes down to training. It's always training, right? The employee technique wasn't allowing for the correct sealing process. Sealing and visual inspections were not taking place. My favorite one is that the sealer switch wasn't turned on. How do you seal a package without having the sealer in the on position, right? Okay, so how can we change these trends? There were 3 things that popped out of all of those things, right? Let's take a look at the design, take a look at the processes, and take a look at the validations. So let's do a little deep dive into those 3 areas. And then I'm going to talk about some testing that can help mitigate those trends. First, you want to make sure that when you evaluate your packaging, that it's evaluated through all the intended processes. We're talking sterilization, handling, distribution, storage. All of those have to be evaluated as part of the validation. This is what a validation plan looks like. It's a 3-legged stool. Not one leg can stand on its own. You need all 3 to support your flat platform. So the effectiveness of the system is demonstrated using integrity, strength, and microbial tests through the use by date. You also need to take into consideration worst case. If you have devices that use similar packaging, you can establish a rationale for justifying only one is validated, and that adopts all the other different sizes into the packaging. These are some of the characteristics that you'll want to consider as you establish that adoption criteria. So let's talk about the test methods. This is my favorite part. When you decide on what your test methods are going to be, it's very important to ensure that all the methods are validated, that you have your repeatability, your reproducibility, and your sensitivity as applicable. It's important to note that the new revision of the 11607 that came out in 2019 and 2020 actually identifies specifically which tests have precision and bias established as part of their methodology. So they've put a nice table together for you guys. You can go quick reference it and see which ones are established. It's also important to recognize that some of these test methods are not going to give you results, but actually are processes, right? Accelerated aging isn't going to tell you, yes, you passed. It's what you do with your samples after you're done that determine whether you pass or fail. So here's a couple tests that I threw in here so that you can look and use those to mitigate these trends of issues with design, validation, and process. Visual inspection is a way that we methodically evaluate the entire package looking for defects. They're common defects, they're listed in the standard. The hard part about this method is the training of your analysts. What you need to do is ensure that one analyst to the next analyst will evaluate those packages exactly the same way. But if right now I grabbed a couple of you guys out of the audience, right, and asked you to do some visual inspection, guess what? Everybody's answers are going to be the same. So training is the critical aspect of visual inspection. Here's a couple examples of failures that were observed in the seal. I highlighted how they've tied back directly to the equipment that had issues. So this is a poly pouch that made it out, and you can see we have an unsealed area. This is probably because of misalignment, but this was an equipment malfunction. The heating platform wasn't heating enough, so we had an inadequate seal. This is non-homogeneous or under-sealed. You can see in the picture, I hope it's kind of hard, but it looks like a nice cloudy day instead of a nice blue sky. That's non-homogeneous or improper sealing. Now, the problem with this characteristic is you have to decide as a manufacturer, how much of a non-homogeneous seal is something that would put your customers at risk. This may be not as big of a deal. As long as I maintain the integrity of the packaging, it could be acceptable. But if it's really bad, then maybe I don't want that, and I'll have to go back to my design and talk about how to change those seals. This is an example of oversealing or using temperatures that are too high. You can see that we have deformation of the actual package. The sealing process actually physically bent this package. Additionally, you can see that there are holes along the entire process, or the seal. But the fun thing about this, I'm sorry, it's not fun for you guys, it's fun for me. The fun thing about this is that when you actually do a dye migration test along the edges here, what you see is that it actually melted to the point where it creates holes along the entire width of the seal. So another test you want to think about is your seal peel test. We saw that over and over and over in both the recalls and in the observations, right? The seal strength is going to tell you how hard it is to open a package and whether it will maintain integrity and strength as it's going through your distribution. This is just a generic assessment of how the test is run. We measure a 1-inch segment, we pull it apart on a tensile tester, and we look to see what the strength value is. We can run this on porous and non-porous tests, so we're not biased, and you get a value. The other option that you have is dye migration. This is another integrity. And as I mentioned with the oversealed, and you inject it and look for penetration through, this is also the same way. So if you have a visual seal that you have a failure and you want to verify if it's still maintaining integrity, you can use ASTM F1929 or F3039, which are the dye migration methods. So one of the other issues that was significantly identified was the shelf life. So I want to go through this a little bit in detail. This is the easiest part of your validation testing, because literally all you do is put it in a chamber with justified parameters and pull it out later. So I want to go through that a little bit. It's regulated by F1980, and it works by following the Arrhenius equation, that for every 10 degrees in increase over ambient, you half the amount of time it takes to establish the shelf life. So what does that mean in English? That's what it means in English. If you go to the 131, 55 degrees. So most aging is recommended to be done at 55 degrees with a Q2 and 25 ambient. At 55 degrees, you can see that it only takes 6.5 weeks to get to a 1 year aging. My cautionary statement here for you is do not play with the Q10 value. We recently have run into a company that it sounded really awesome. They use a Q10 of 3. And I was super excited because I thought I'd run into some chemical engineers that knew everything about their plastics and how they interacted. And when we got into the discussion, well, we did it because it was faster. So unfortunately, they had to go back and redo all their testing. So the Q10 of 2 is recommended by the document because it's the most conservative, and the FDA looks for that value. So when you do your accelerated aging, as I started in the beginning of the topic, I said make sure you justify your test conditions. If you go outside of anything that they're happy seeing, you have to justify that. They like to see an ambient temperature of 25. They like to see a temperature of 55 degrees, and they like their Q10 of 2. Now, I'm sure you guys all know that like is a little easier to justify than going outside of what they want, what you want to do. It's also really important to think about relative humidity as part of accelerated aging. I want to let you know that there's a new working group right now that is looking at bringing in relative humidity to the aging standards, because you guys have gotten so awesome with all these films and packaging materials that the lack of humidity in an aging chamber is actually becoming more detrimental than what would happen in a real life environment. So those changes are in process, and those standards are going to be updated to take a look at those different types of materials. Do we want to do this with or without products? If you can, we do want to do it with product. We want to ensure that the interaction between both the package and the device is evaluated, not just the pouches. If you can't afford to put your actual devices in, then you can use simulated devices or dummy product. That's acceptable. But you do have to justify why that's acceptable. Similar weight, similar dimensions, things like that. Revalidation was one that popped up, but not as frequent. Making sure that if any changes occur to the original validation are addressed in either a risk assessment or additional testing. As the arrow points out, the most frequent changes are if you change the sterile barrier system, the process equipment, the device, or the sterilization. As we're starting to move into the focus of sterilization and ethylene oxide reduction studies, it's going to be important not to forget to think about, if I reduce my exposure to ethylene oxide, does that impact the packaging validation that I have on file? So taking a look at those kinds of things. If I switch to a new method, will that affect packaging? So keep those in mind. So in summary, I asked you, how can we change these trends? The answer is here. Design, making sure that the system is designed right from the start. Number 2, processes, making sure that your equipment is qualified and outputs what you need and have validated. And then, of course, your validations, making sure that the testing that you've selected is justified and done according to the standards. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to help and answer them. We have lots of fun stuff for you at booth 3135. So anybody can go up there. We love having you guys come. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you.